Good morning, and while the panelists are getting settled, I know we promised you a coffee break, but as Tisha said, we're going to plow through, and hopefully we can make this worth your while. Welcome to the session on the cloud state. This is as high level as it goes, and hopefully, like I said, we can make this meaningful to you, recognizing that there are folks in this room who have perhaps not been acquainted as much as they would have liked to with the debates on global governance of digital spaces and so on and so forth. And hopefully we can make this meaningful to you using concrete examples about the role of the state and the future of the state in managing digital spaces, in interacting with industry and its citizen subjects, as well as its own internal bureaucratic machinations. Because this is what at its core, what this panel is going to be about. And to talk about these discussions, about these rumination, or to ruminate about these forward-looking problems that the state is likely to encounter, we have a very good set of panelists. I'm not going to introduce them because their bios are already with you, but I will say this, that they represent constituencies, all of whom are extremely relevant to the space, to the governance of digital spaces. We don't, interestingly, have somebody from the state because, one, we would have had to figure out which state to represent. Is it the United States, the Chinese government, or the Indian government, and so on and so forth. We didn't want to get into that, so we thought, why don't we comment on the state from the outside in, given that as individuals we are citizens of various states that we come from, and we also have somebody from an international government organization, the United Nations, and also look at it from a vantage point of an IGO that looks at an aggregation of states and how states deal with some of the contemporary challenges facing digital governance. So with that brief spiel, let me first hand it over to Andre, who is a political officer at the United Nations, but our hypothesis is that Andre has not indicated to the UN that he is here, because everything that Andre has said, either on the panel or while holding the mic as a member of the audience, has been controversial. So Andre, if he has lost his job, he's already lost his job, and Andre, I'm sure, will be more than candid while expressing his views on the role of the UN and the challenges faced by the UN in managing 21st century politics with 20th century institutions. It sort of goes back to the discussion we had in the opening panel today, and I faced some heat from some of you while calling for, well, not calling for war, but saying that conflict perhaps is the thing that is needed for mankind in order to create new institutional arrangements to manage digital spaces. But I would say, not to put words in Andre's mouth, but at some level he perhaps agrees with me to the extent that the UN has been able or unable to manage the kind of politics that we see in cyberspace today. Andre, what can you tell us about what the UN has been able to do, whether it has been successful entirely, and what it plans to do now?
Thank you, Arun, for making this more troublesome than it had to be. I'm looking forward to finding a job with ORF right after I get fired, after everything I might have said already. Thank you for attending this panel and for ORF to setting it up. To try to answer that question, we have to step back a little bit. We all remember the UN was born in 1945 after the Second World War. And in a way, while looking forward, the founders of the UN were really looking back and trying not to fall victims of what they've just experienced, a devastating world war, which is why the Charter of the UN really starts with the words to preserve us from the scourges of war. So you could argue that the whole justification for the existence of the UN is to do everything to prevent war from coming back, or at least at the level we've seen it. Now I work for the UN, so I'm bound to say we're doing a great job at that. I hope you believe me. Looking at the whole debate about the global governance of the internet infrastructure for the past 20 years, one thing is noticeable. At first, the UN wasn't really part of the discussion, wasn't the place where the discussion took place. It was from outside. Progressively, and we've seen it since 2005 with the World Summit on the Information Society, what the UN has attempted to do is to be the platform, the format where discussion takes place, because the UN brings to any discussion of global importance two things. One, the convening power, because all of us, through our states, are represented. And two, a measure of legitimacy no other organization has. Now, that being said, it has become obvious over the past 20 years of all this discussion around the governance on the internet and cybersecurity, some of which were touched upon over the past few days. It has become obvious that the UN is not the main player in this game. It's not unusual. We've seen that before. We've seen that with discussions around the human rights architecture in the 90s. We've seen that to a certain extent around the issue of climate change. What is happening is that the UN tries to direct the debates towards more cooperation, towards respecting human rights, towards making sure that the issue of cybersecurity are dealt with for the benefit of all or the majority. But in effect, the truth is, much of the discussion, as you're all aware of because you're part of them, take place out of the UN, and they reflect really, to a large sense, the division we see on the international scene on international relations. I have in mind something I was watching a few days ago, a documentary you probably have heard of, where someone makes the case, and we know it's true because we've seen it all, that data have become one of the most important commodities to have. And as a result, because this is, well, not akin to natural resources, but something not far from it, it has become the focus of intense competition, and countries and other actors, private actors, are literally on the international scene to a certain extent fighting the same fight they've fought over oil and over other aspects. So in this context, the UN tries to play the role of working towards greater cooperation, working towards a world at peace, including online, but in effect, we're not the main or the only actor.
Thanks, Andre. And I think the point that you mentioned about the UN having been sort of conceived in the aftermath of war and therefore constantly looking ahead while looking back is relevant, because I think it was at an ORF event recently where persons will not be named, but there was a diplomat and who was talking to some of our scholars, and he said, if we were to attempt to renegotiate the Geneva Conventions today, the concessions on sovereignty that the state gave in 1949 or around the time that the Geneva Conventions periodically were negotiated, it's impossible that the states negotiating those conventions will concede that sovereignty again. This is not the moment for it. And so across the world, among like-minded governments, liberal democracies, and I'm sure in many UN institutions as well, there is in fact fear that if you reopen the box of international human rights conventions to accommodate the digital, the rights and responsibilities that the digital age brings, people worry whether we will lose more than what we have already gained. And I thought the way that you framed it was is excellent. And one of the constituency that stands to, perhaps, I don't want to prejudge the outcome, but one of the communities that definitely looks like it is going to face a tough time in the coming years and months on account of automation, account of autonomous technologies, is the workforce, the bread and butter workforce that fuels the life of an economy. And while we started at 30,000 feet, I want to sort of dig deep and come to Astha, who has been working through her, of course, own scholarship, as well as through her work at the Bangalore-based think tank that she is a co-founder of, Aapti, on the problems that are faced by coalitions of labor unions, of workforces that are finding it difficult to aggregate, collectivize, mobilize in the digital age. Because there's a lot of talk about how platforms can improve your livelihoods, you can provide them universal basic income on account of digital platforms. But something that's being lost, in addition to the potential loss of livelihoods on account of automation, is that there does not seem to be any institutional remedies available to workers of the gig economy. And the UN recently convened a high-level panel on digital cooperation. Unless I'm very mistaken, there was nobody representing labor unions or trade coalitions in that high-level panel. the people who created it, in their wisdom, perhaps did not believe that this was an important constituency to address. Astha, how would you say that this constituency should navigate the challenges of the 21st century vis-a-vis the state, as well as big technology companies, some of whom have increasingly resembled the state?
Right. So first of all, I like to start with the fact that unions now is not a good word to use. We're using worker collectives or coalitions. We've been advised to do that, so I would pass that on to you. But basically, I think that what we are seeing increasingly is that there is a need for these worker collectives and coalitions. And those are growing in a fairly large way. We've seen that it's become a huge concern in the American presidential campaign right now. You know, the AB5, which is the Workers' Act, just got passed. Even in India, we're looking up to, to give some kind of social security to our 2.2 million people who work on the platform economy. And so, I mean, the general sense is that there is a need for collectivization. And what technology does is that it atomizes your experience as a worker on the platform. It also, these platforms are fairly good at union busting. So it doesn't allow you to collectivize in any way. But our research is showing increasingly that technology itself, right? So WhatsApp groups are becoming a good place for workers to collectivize, whether it's in the form of like, this is where surge pricing is in the case of Uber and Ola drivers, or don't go to that house because that man is a creep. People are finding ways to reach out to other gig economy workers and find ways to connect with them through this technology. There are other examples, right, where for instance, in China, there's a growing movement called 996, which is a protest against the 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week work that tech workers do. They set up a GitHub page, which was then asked to be shut down, but GitHub is owned by Microsoft. So in response to that, Microsoft tech workers went out and said, no, GitHub should be uncensored. So as a result of that, you're also seeing that this sort of shared struggle, and a lot of the Zomato food delivery group is called the Food Delivery Shared Struggle Group. So there is a sense of this shared struggle that is emerging. You are also seeing things like the Tech Workers Coalition that is emerging in chapters in different parts of the world. There is one in Bangalore, which is looking at questions of education around working in the gig economy. It's talking about aspects of social security. There's also things like, Tech Won't Build, which is a movement of engineers coming together. Right. We're also looking at things like the Amazon walkout for climate change. We saw the 20,000 workers of Google walking out. So the sense of the old sort of collectivization and collective bargaining is coming up. There are also things such as platform corporates that are coming up, where you have gig economy, and that's a reality of our time, but can we do it in a way that the workers own the code and are already organized at the point that they get onto the platform? So in my sense, I think that there is a fair amount of solidarity among the workers' movement that is built up. It is being built up across geographies because there's a sense that the struggle of a gig economy or a platform worker is similar, whether you are doing microtasking for AI labeling or you're doing shared economy work on Uber or Ola or Urban Clap. The struggle is the same, and there's also an attempt to come together with the engineers who are building it. And finally, I think that we need to hold the companies accountable and somehow need to ally with the government. The government, unfortunately, both with regulation around work and technology, hasn't kept up. So a lot of the focus of the worker collectives is on organizations and how to hold those accountable. And there are not necessarily good answers, but collectives are a way that's going forward.
Do you feel, just to follow up on that, do you feel this time it's different because the fact that technology has disrupted and in fact galvanized labor movements historically is not in doubt. But there was always a single point of aggregation. For instance, it used to be the factory floor historically, where the onslaught of machines would bring people together to create so-called collectives. Do you feel that the gig economy, and you put it very nicely by atomizing the workforce, do you feel that the ability of unions and collectives to interact with the state and get what they want? For instance, in India, were you to open the Factories Act or the Workmen's Compensation Act to renegotiation. Do you feel that new age collectives will have the same bargaining power as their 20th century counterparts?
I think that we're on our way to figure out, because so first of all, on that question of space, right?
Yeah.
It no longer is a physical space, but I think that there is a technologically enabled space that is being
Right.
created for workers to come together. And there are sizable numbers, 6,000 workers last month from Bangalore and Mumbai, Zomato delivery boys
Yeah.
were protesting. It really fairly disrupted the lives of people like you and I who rely on food delivery. So there's also a sense from the consumer perspective that's also opening up on the working conditions, which I think is a big part. And yes, will they hold the state accountable over time in the counter as the 20th century workforce did? Possibly. But I think that the self-reflexiveness also has to come from technology companies.
Great. So, in the vein of constituencies that have been marginalized or look to be marginalized with the advent of automated machines or autonomous machines, another constituency which is much maligned but at the same time is not adequately representative enough is that of the global civil society. And this, over the years, has come to represent many things, as with the case of the blind man and the elephant. The idea of global society is different to those who are part of these collectives themselves or NGOs that represent, in most cases, the voices of the ordinary user. But increasingly, we have seen that that civil society too is subject to capture and is not exactly an honest arbiter of the interests of the user while representing its concerns either before the state or before a collection of states. And perhaps the most amount of criticism has been directed towards what is called the multi-stakeholder advisory group of the Internet Governance Forum, which historically has been subject to criticism that it represents voices, of course, well-meaning voices from the global north, and although they may represent civil society, they represent a small component of the global civil society. To talk to us about that, we have Ephraim, and Ephraim has been, at a very young age, he is actively involved in internet governance discussions. He was himself a part first of the Youth Mag and subsequently the Mag, if I'm not mistaken, and has seen it from the vantage point of exactly the constituency that I was talking about, one that has very few advocates. One of them is Ephraim. But having been an insider for all these years and having just left the MAG perhaps last year, as recently as last year, what are your thoughts about the interaction of constituencies within the so-called umbrella group of global civil society, and how do they represent interest before the state?
Hello, yeah, so I'm glad you've asked the question. Thanks for putting me on the spot. Regarding how the MAG works and whether it works for the user, there's been attempts. I remember prior to 2014, we, as a youth Coalition on Internet Governance, YCIG, we really lobbied the UN and the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to try and have more young people, more people from the global south than before, and that happened then. But the challenge remains whereby once you're inside, how much change can you really push? How much change can you really achieve? So the MAG, how the MAG works, it has around 55 people nominated by the UN Secretary General. So I served for 3 years, first 2 years under Ban Ki-moon, and the last year under Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General. And the challenge with that is it's multi-stakeholder. So multi-stakeholder decisions are not easy to make. It's not one stakeholder. So you cannot really push your agenda fully because there's government officials, there's corporations, so you have to negotiate. And the negotiation sometimes you can get lost in the negotiation process. So the challenge with so how that is working or not working, maybe just to add voices to that, and maybe to add to the petition that was sent back then 2014, 2013, is that we need more voices from the global south. We need more young people to get onto these spaces because in this age, sorry to say this, but I'm going to be very blunt on this now that I'm no longer on the MAG. We don't need someone who's 70 or 60 making decisions about AI, which it's young people who are doing the coding. It's young people who are going to be more more affected by this. So we need more young people, more people from the global south into these spaces. And for example, as I mentioned, I kind of joked about this with some delegates from Africa here yesterday. Was we have 1 billion people from Africa who are going to be the next internet users the next couple of years. So we need more representation in these spaces. So in this age of where the state is trying to exert its power through the cloud, or people trying to organize using the cloud, there is need for more representation, more multi-stakeholderism than before. But the challenge with that, as I mentioned, the challenge with the multi-stakeholder model is that sometimes it's not everyone who can be able to get the access or even the funding to be able to attend some of these negotiations, some of these conversations. So there is need for more resources and more looking at this from a sustainable point of view on how can the UN IGF, how can it work together with and help provide some learnings to the ITU, to ICANN. How can the ICANN model, which has worked to some extent more successful than other models in coming up with impact, how can it be replicated in other parts of internet governance spaces?
I like that throughout your remarks, your opening salvo, you didn't even mention the word state once, right? And there's something to be, while I agree with you that, if the internet is going to affect young people more, then they should be in charge of decision making rather than 70-year-olds. But how is it any different from the state? I mean, most presidents and prime ministers across the world are 70-year-olds, and they are more in charge of the affairs of their citizenry than, say, global civil society coalitions. Why shouldn't civil society organizations be led by 70-year-old white men? I mean, I'm trying to figure out how is it any different from the other agglomerations that we have, mostly run by states.
So the challenge also with the state, and I'm sure you've seen this, especially in Europe, there's more young people getting elected to power, or even, for example, there is an Ethiopian prime minister who's very young as compared to the rest of African leaders. So there's more young people getting also in political power, and they understand the issues, and they would be there to be able to, they relate more with the issues. So my criticism about old white person getting in charge.
White was my introduction. I'm sorry.
Yes. My criticism does not just go to the internet governance space, but also just generally, we need more people who are affected by decisions. For example, right now, I cannot be a man seated here making decisions about women or what they should or should not do. So the same way it should apply also to the internet and these spaces, such that you need to ensure that where there are going to be more users, where there's going to be more people affected, the people who are affected are part of the decision making. So my approach to this topic is that it's a multi-stakeholder conversation and not a responsibility of the state only. Each stakeholder has a different responsibility or a different opportunity to engage in this space, as in the WISI's declaration that my colleague just mentioned.
Thanks. One can only hope, Ephraim. Let me now come to Rohit, and I want to sort of preface my question to Rohit by offering, especially for those who are from abroad, by offering some sort of a context to the kind of work that Rohit, who is a group president at Reliance Industries, which is also the company that runs Jio, which is today India's biggest technology company, and the work that he's been doing, and the specific run-ins that Jio has today faced with the state, which sort of ties in many ways to the discussions that we've had, because here is a company that is providing technology to people for various reasons, including those of commercial profit making, so on and so forth. But here is an example also where the state has intervened in ways that perhaps restricts the access of technology that is provided by a private company, or in some cases the lack of clarity with regards to what should be the regulatory vision for technology in the 21st century has hampered the ability of a big company to provide technology. I've told Rohit that long before Facebook said move fast and break things, Reliance has done it. And what they did essentially by transitioning from a company that relied for the longest time on petrochemicals to a digital first company is perhaps unprecedented in the history of corporations across the world. To frame an imperfect analogy, it is like saying IKEA will stop making furniture and get into the job of confectionaries. The only thing that would be useful to IKEA in that case would be the furniture that they use as infrastructure. In this case, Reliance did not even have the kind of infrastructure that was needed to build a robust telecommunications network across the country. They certainly did have the resources, but they've done it. What has happened, and this is sort of in the lead up to my question to Rohit, what has happened in recent weeks, and in fact just as recently as yesterday, is that there is a regulation in India that imposes what is called an interconnectivity user charge, which essentially is a fee that somebody, the carrier pays while connecting to another network of another carrier. So if I'm using Jio's network, Jio pays interconnectivity user charge if my phone is to another unnamed network. That's an outside network. And some time ago, the Indian government had decided that the regulator, rather, not the government, the Indian telecom regulator had decided that you need to face down interconnectivity charges with a view to ensuring that there is an unencumbered flow of information as well as seamless transitioning of calls from one operator to the other. Interestingly, that provision has now, or at least is in various stages of being rethought by the Indian regulator. And for those of you who've been following the news, Jio has come out strongly and remarkably against the telecom regulator's plans to not, or to keep in suspension any decision to reduce the interconnectivity charges, because it feels that it has provided 4G technology to many parts of India. Its competitors apparently have not, and therefore why is it being penalized? So the argument goes from Jio, why is it being penalized for providing advanced technology to the population while its competitors are trying to milk revenue from what is essentially a 20th century regulation? These regulations on interconnectivity charges were framed in the late 90s and early 2000s. With that, it's a sort of a technical issue, but I wanted to bring it up and I wanted to talk to Rohit about it because fundamentally it cuts to the heart of the debate that we are having today. Here is a company, a big technology company that is willing to provide, based on its own sort of heft of resources, advanced technology to the citizenry, but the state is having second thoughts. Rohit, how willing are you to defend the interests and the motivations of Jio in this case?
Wow. Sure ranks as the longest question ever posed. Having said that, I just wanted
Can you move your mic?
With the permission of the chair, a quick understanding. Is anyone here who is using data? Could I have a show of hands? Anybody uses data here?
This is a trick question.
Okay. I wouldn't embarrass to ask who doesn't use data. But I imagine that considering that almost everyone in this august room uses data, I would submit that almost everyone outside this room also uses data. And therefore, it is a very democratizing process that has been going on in India over the last maybe 2 or 3 years. And I don't mean to say it in a self-serving way, sir. But just to take off from where we left off in sci-fi Morocco, we have in Jio alone 350 million folks who are on our network, and I'm sure there are others on the other 2 or 3. So having said that, that's the sort of people connect and the sheer efficiency and lubrication in the economic process that is happening thanks to data. So it is not about one company or the other. I think it is about ordinary people like us and everyone else, including those outside the room. Having said that, the kind of flows the chairman confessed to me in a rare moment of weakness that he was spending about 498 rupees, which is for 1 gigabyte of data not so long back. And I don't want to intrude on what network he now uses, but typically it's become about 10 to 12 rupees a gigabyte in India. So the kind of rate crashes and the sheer importance of that to our daily lives and what we do without even thinking twice about logging on to high-speed movie binging or accessing our bank or accessing a video call to our loved ones far away, including, I dare say, for the third time and the last time, I promise, to people who are not so advantaged as us to be speaking and listening and interacting in this fora. So the economic value add and the sheer usage of man's progress in technology, I think, is a matter that is a no-brainer now. I think everybody is more or less clear that this is helpful in a meaningful way to ordinary lives. And I think to just nuance and somewhat put to reflection for this audience, it is not that the regulator or the government or anybody from the state is actually coming in the way of what we are trying to do. We are here only to remind the regulator of what it has submitted before a court of law. And they have said in 2017 on their own and not for any other reason that technology and the impact it is having on people is something that allows them to think of the 6 paisa charges. 6 paisa is nothing, it's probably 8 cents or something. No, it's not 8 cents.
It's even less than that.
No, it's far lesser than that. It's 0.8 cents. Yeah, less than a cent. So that is not the issue. The fact is that when we multiply it with the 350 crore, 350 million people on the network, and we see it from the point of view of what we are paying for an incumbent network to receive a call from our side to them, it adds up, ladies and gentlemen, to $2 billion US. 13,500 crore is what Jio alone has paid for just somebody from our network calling up a third-party network. So that's a lot of money incentivizing long enough the older technology, and it rests, Mr. Chairman, on what the regulator has said on its own 2 years back, that they will remove the interconnect charge, the IUC, within 1st January 2020. And now there is a consultation paper, which I don't know how many of you are following, but which doesn't talk of bringing it down from 6 paisa to maybe 4 paisa or 2 paisa or 1 paisa, and its implicit impact at the aggregate level. It's about deferring it as it is, which we dare say is a way to incentivize legacy networks, and which is a disincentive correspondingly to those who use technology. So, short reply to a long question.
So, Rohit, I'm not going to let you go there. Were you to be the incumbent in this case, the legacy networks, as you, the magic word that you said is incumbent. In this case, you're faced with a scenario that, we're talking about the rollout of 4G technology to the vast majority of India. You have incumbent networks which admittedly have been slow to roll out that technology, and we now have a disruptor. And unlike other disruptors, say in the mold of Silicon Valley, this is not a small startup. You are a fairly well-established shop by way of your capital and the investment and the talent that you are able to attract to your shop. Were you to be the incumbent in this case, wouldn't you have justified the state's decision-making or the state's, at least the state's refusal to immediately cut down, in this case, interconnectivity charges?
This is a very difficult assumption to make, because we were perhaps the 14th player to enter. So if you look at it this way, we had a huge, disadvantage to start with. And just quickly, as a startled employee at the start of my career in this company, I noticed that we were betting on a frequency which had no takers. We had bet on 2300 megahertz. People thought we were crazy. We bet on loading voice onto that frequency which had not been done at any scale. We then were denied the whole business of interconnect. I couldn't call from a geo number to another number. The other number could not reach me. And then the handset ecosystem was such that nobody gave us a chance. Everybody said, we're going to hold on to our old network and we are not going to migrate. So the conceptual clarity is missing in me, that what if I was something else? I am what I am. And I was the 14th player. Having said that, I think it's important to understand three very quick things, Mr. Chairman. One, what is benefiting the last man or the last woman in this country? Two, what is technologically most efficient for making sure that the economic value add in each person's life is a little better? And third, what has already been conceded and understood and appreciated by the regulators and the leaderships themselves. So we should be asking this question to someone else rather than someone who's
and
done what
not
they
assume
have.
that you are the incumbent. That's fair enough. And in many ways, I want to bring in Sabrina at this point. It reflects the difficulty that the state has in balancing many interests. Essentially, going back to the rich legacy of political science literature in this field. What has happened with Reliance Jio and what is happening in other domains of digital governance is that the state would like for, in this case, roll out new technology, faster connectivity to the rest of to the population. I don't think that's in doubt, because the political fortunes of a government rests on easier, affordable connectivity. But at the same time, the shadow of the incumbents loom large on the government, and there are sort of channels of politics which are perhaps not visible to the naked eye, but at the same time, these are also industry representatives that the state can't easily ignore. Given those challenges, where would you tie, the conversations that we've thus far had with labor unions, with big technology companies, with civil society organizations? Is it really possible for the state to manage these interests at the, perhaps there were instances where the state represented all these interests beautifully, but at the scale and speed with which we are talking about digital governance, is it really feasible?
Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you very much for throwing me a softball question. As a political philosopher, before we came in here, I was like, I'm just going to talk about all of the failings of philosophy over the past 50 years. So by training, I'm a political philosopher, and we have spent the best part of the last 50 years wondering, debating the role of the individual versus the role of the state. Do individuals owe moral duties to one another? Because of the global interactions, I'm affecting people in India, I'm affecting people in China, vice versa. That said, the state obviously has this kind of binding moral capacity on us that we tend to think about. And the digital revolution has in very many ways rendered this debate moot. The role of the state is changing, whether or not we philosophers like it, and so we have to find another way forward. And so just like everybody on this panel has talked about, a lot of the old themes in philosophy are now coming back. Democratization. We used to think democracy was a dead issue. Liberal democracy was the end of history, as one philosopher put it, and that's no longer seeming to be the case. So democracy is becoming important again. Democracy in the workplace, particularly like Astha talked about. States are also always going to be, as you said, playing catch up. Yeah. Just because of the speed of technology and the nature of the state. They can't keep up. So the burden does fall then to individuals, to labor unions, and unfortunately or fortunately, to multinationals to come up with responsible ways to govern us, ways to govern the so-called cloud state. And the other thing then, going back to the UN and other multinational institutions, they have a new burden that is going to be helping us coordinate all of these changes. In the prompt in the kind of like section about this talk, it says states have more control over us than they ever had before. And that's true, but in many ways, individuals are also bypassing the state. Right. Like Astha talked about WhatsApp. The state doesn't necessarily have control over who's talking to whom and what's going on. And so to avoid this kind of insularity between both individuals or amongst individuals internationally, but also to avoid states becoming too insular and just trying to control their citizens, international institutions also have a moral duty then to help us try to coordinate these new governance problems that we're facing.
Thanks. We have 15 minutes or so, but we don't have to go through the full 15 minutes because I know we crunched on your coffee break, but we can take a few, maybe 2 or 3 questions, and if you have any questions, please feel free to take the mic on either sides. But I do have one for both Andre and Rohit, and forgive me for being mischievous. If you found yourself trapped in an elevator with the head of your respective organizations for 2 minutes, for whatever, there is a blackout or a cyber attack or something of that sort. And you had 2 minutes to make a pitch to your respective bosses. In that case, in Andre's case, it would be the UN Secretary General, and with Rohit's case, it would be the Chairman of Reliance Industries Limited. What would your message be to your respective bosses as to how you should redefine the relationship of your respective companies or corporations or organization with respect to the state? So Andre, we're going to start with you because your job is probably more secure than Rohit's, given the nature of my question.
I think you just got me fired a few minutes ago. So the first thing I would tell to the Secretary General is to get me my job back. That would be one thing. No, but if I had that chance, I would actually make the case, the not very popular case of defending the state in this context, in this changing context and very fluid context, for one simple reason. As far as we know, as history goes, the state came about because or through the decision by some actors to take the power of taxation and the power to make war. That's how the state was created. Ever since, the state has been the fundamental actor on the international scene, making it possible for for countries not to be at war all the time. And the UN was created to do just that. And although when you look at the map of the world, there are a lot of conflicts, in a wider sense, we haven't gone back to the Third World War. So I will argue to the SG that although he hears a lot coming from tech conference and everywhere else, that the state is out of fashion and it shouldn't be defended, there still is a place in this changing world of new technology dominance, and we have to advocate and find a way of being important. I'm making that point because in the previous discussion here, I heard someone making the case almost, he didn't say it, but I felt like I heard him make the case that private companies had fundamentally as people, our interests at heart, and the state often doesn't. I'm caricaturing. I actually will stand on the opposite side of that discussion. Private companies are there to make profit. Yeah. They do other things as well, and that's good, but they're there to make profits. The state is that fundamental, important actor that can ensure that all of us benefit from the changes that are occurring. So that will be my very long pitch.
What I'm going to do now is edit that video and then send it to the office of the UNSG. But Rohit, what about you?
Sir, I didn't know you liked me so much. And what I didn't know is that you rate my chances even worse than Andre's. But honestly speaking, if I got 2 minutes, which I often do, I just have to speak the first 5 seconds. If a boss is of any consequence, they speak the rest. So at any rate, I have 2 bosses. One is, of course, the chairman of Reliance Industries. And 5 years before I joined Reliance 5 years back, so 10 years back, I got myself a boss who all of you know, which is Samir Saran. So again, in his case, I just have to speak the first 5 seconds. The rest he takes over. So having said that, and that's a gratis role that I've had for 10 years with ORF. Now, critically, I think, first I would say the state is a friend. the state is representative of the people of India, and should you have any problems with the state, you have a problem with the people of India. Yes, the state has various interlocutors who interpret policy in a different sort of way in their own endeavor, but I would bring him to my own area of interest and some expertise, which is democratize, communicate around what people are feeling. So if I had a problem in getting interconnect agreements from other telecom networks, rather than write long letters to the government and say that, please, TRAI, do the following. On my part, what I would do is to film, or rather take snaps from 2,000 geo stores with 2,000 people standing in front of each one of them to get the first SIM, which was free. So 2,000 multiplied by 2,000 with the photographs and used on handles like yours, and sometimes you have also 1 in 100 times retweeted me. That's good enough. The state listens. And today's state is very responsive to what's happening in the digital domain and in the people's domain. And at that time, the minister, as well as the others, took a view that if so many people are waiting for a service like this, I think it's not good enough for the incumbents to say, we will not be able to provide infrastructure to connect that many people to our own networks and vice versa. So go visual, go people, have faith, connect, communicate, and by then the elevator would open and he would go.
Excellent, excellent. Let's take a couple of questions from both sides now and try to wrap up in the 8 minutes that we have.
Sir, I'm H.S. Sharma, oldest living IITian of India, 80-year-old. I have some question to Madam Astha. You have discussed only dignified labor. What about undignified labor in my society? There are millions of domestic help who have no rights, no rules follow anywhere in this country. I live in Gurgaon. At least 1 or 2 are raped. And
I think we understood the question, sir.
Let me complete, sir.
I think your point is well taken, and I will.
It is never discussed. They have no dignity. They have no rules. They are citizens of this country.
I agree.
There is a Constitution of India. They work in the security. They cannot sit on the chair. They keep on standing, suffer from varicose vein. Where do I go? Madam Astha, would you help? Millions of them are there in my country. There is no rules, no regulation, state or otherwise. Please help me.
Absolutely.
Thanks. I will come back to Astha with that
Yeah.
question, but let's take one question from that side as well.
Hello. My name is Soham. My question is to Rohit. As we loom over 5G auctions in the next few months, how would the telecom sector be viable in terms of the profitability when there is a high leverage that the companies are taking? And do you see a penetration happening into the markets, because 33% is 2G and 3G call networks? So how do you see the penetration, and do you see the profitability in 5G networks in India?
Thanks. Astha, do you want to field the first question?
Sure. We were discussing tech-mediated work, which is how I read the question. But in the context of domestic workers and other informal workers in India, this work that I have done in the past as well, there are several regulations such as the Domestic Workers Act, as well as, which I think remains the bill, as well as the Informal Workers Act, which talks about how can we better organize, give social security, etc. In the context of technology, and I think that may be some kind of a give in this way, because more and more tech-mediated work is looking at social security more acutely, as well as I said, gives an opportunity to this disparate workforce to be on the same platform and actually build alliances, coalitions, and negotiate for better terms. So that, I think, is the short answer, but in that there is regulation for domestic workers and other informal workers.
Thanks. Rohit, you want to take the question on 5G?
There is a publicly stated position we have.
Can you drag the mic towards you?
My understanding is that at the current expectation levels, there is great merit in the question our audience member has raised.
Let's take a couple of questions here. Sir?
Thank you. My name is Amir. I work with eGovernments Foundation. Question to, I guess, maybe Sabrina and or Astha, which is, we've spoken about ways in which citizens interact with the state. One of those modes is also to actually want to interact in ways that are private or not visible to the state. And my understanding is that both legally and philosophically, there are different interpretations of this around the world. The EU is walking one path, India seems to be on a different one. Does that play out in regulations and policy? How do you think we see that?
So if I were to paraphrase that, would the question be, should the state confer on its citizens the right not for the state to pry on your private channels of communication, right?
To the extent
To a broad
that
extent.
we think states have different philosophies on this, yes.
Ah, okay, great. Sir.
My name is Rajiv Saxena. I have a question for Rohit. I read in newspaper that about 35 crore people make a missed call to other network. Sorry, the other way around. The people from the other network, numbering about 35 crore, make a missed call to the Zio Excel one, and so that he can make a call because you have made your calls absolutely free. My question to you, I have a feeling that Jio will make all their phone calls free, but maybe start charging on the value addition services which it will offer on its cell phone.
Okay, thank you. Sabrina, you want to take the question on?
Sure, that's such a great question, and privacy is such a difficult and multi-layered issue. I mean, we can't even decide what data is. Is it an asset? Is it something you have ownership over? Is it a negative externality, as one of the speakers said yesterday? So that's the first thing we need to decide. How are we going to conceptualize data? And I think that that's where the state needs to start. And like you've kind of pointed out, different states are going to have different conceptions of that. The other thing is then going back to kind of what Rohit said, as citizens in a democracy, if the state does represent its citizens, what do the citizens want? And I think that that could be a good way to drive the policies. European citizens are quite concerned about privacy, but citizens in other states might be concerned about better state benefits, and therefore the state needs to collect more data. So then the problem then becomes how data crosses borders and how these emerging data governance regimes affect international trade and international interactions. And that is yet to be seen. I don't think I gave you an answer, but I gave you a lot to think about, hopefully.
Thanks, Sabrina. Rohit, you want to take the question on value-added services?
So I think...
when will you start charging?
I think we have a very clear and consistent policy that you should not, as a consumer, be paying for two services, data and voice together. So basically, that's what the position is even today. There was an external context that the interconnect charge will go in a publicly stated court document will go on the 1st of January 2020. And on that basis, the entire thing is going on, that we are free as far as the voice charge is concerned. We charge 10 to 15 rupees per gigabyte for data. And considering that the government, the TRAI has said that they would want some replies on whether the deadline should be pushed back rather than the 6 paisa be brought down successively, we feel there is an uncertainty. So during that period, we are simply taking that money and passing it, by way of a corresponding amount of data extra. So no charge on phones as far as we are concerned on voice calls. And everyone and their aunt are on data, and the amount of WhatsApp messages and videos that we all consume is well known. I think some of us are being asked this question that in Hindi that WhatsApp karne ke alawa kya karte ho? So that's basically because...
What else are you doing besides WhatsApp?
So voice remains to be free as far as our interpretation of the existing uncertainty is concerned. And the day it is made zero as per 2017 assertion of TRAI before the court, it's back to the good days again.
Thanks. We have 1 minute, and I'm going to cede the floor to the youngest of our panelists, because we should not be talking about internet governance in the age of the youth wanting to have some say in managing digital spaces. Ephraim, the question is to you. Now, if you were stuck in an elevator with a 70-year-old who is probably in charge of managing digital spaces or has some role in it, what would you say to him or her, and how would you want to change the person's thinking towards the management of digital spaces?
Thanks for that difficult question. It depends on who it is, but one thing that I would maybe urge is that we need to look at the internet or as technology as something positive, the same way we've seen like mechanization of agriculture and other things. There's some conversations whether it's positive or negative, but I would view it as a positive thing that we need to allow for it to grow, the space to grow, and not over-regulate and not stop innovation. So we need to allow the space to grow and ensure that there's room for young people to develop new apps, develop new hardware, and also to ensure that they are secure and they respect the rights of the users.
Thanks. Your brevity leads me to believe that there is hope for the future. On that note, please join me in thanking this wonderful set of panelists for sparing their time and their intellectual capital in talking about this issue with us today.